I used to believe that love meant sacrifice, that giving everything of yourself to another person was the purest form of devotion. I used to believe that if I just loved hard enough, selflessly enough, desperately enough, it would be returned to me tenfold. I was wrong about everything. My name is Sarah, and I died at 23 with nothing but regret burning in my chest, and Ryan's hatred echoing in my ears. The last thing I saw was his face, twisted with disgust, telling me that everything was my fault, that his lover's ruined future, his shattered dreams, his wasted potential, all of it could be traced back to me and my pathetic, clinging love. And then I woke up in my childhood bed, 16 again, with sunlight streaming through the paper-thin walls of our village house, and the sound of my mother calling me for breakfast. But this wasn't a dream. This was a second chance, a rebirth that came with the cruel gift of memory. Every moment of pain, every betrayal, every sacrifice that led to nothing but emptiness. This time, I would choose differently. The first time I lived this life, Ryan arrived in our village like a prince from a fairy tale. He was 19, sent from the city to work in our grain distribution center as part of some government program. With his clean clothes, his proper pronunciation, and his air of cosmopolitan sophistication, he seemed like everything our small world was not. The village girls whispered about him behind their hands, but I was the one who fell completely, utterly, stupidly in love when he mentioned needing a place to stay, something better than the moldy dormitory, the village. Provided I didn't hesitate, I gave him my room, the best room in our house, the one with the window that caught the morning light. I moved into the cramped storage space with my younger sister, sleeping on a makeshift bed of straw mats and old quilts. When he complained about the food, I gave him my portions. When he needed money for his mysterious city expenses, I handed over the coins I'd saved from helping neighbors with their harvests. I thought I was being generous. I thought I was showing him how much I cared. I thought that my sacrifice would make him see me, really see me, as someone worthy of his love. Instead, I was enabling his selfishness and training him to expect everything from me while giving nothing. In return, the first life, Ryan took everything I offered and more. He lived in comfort while I grew thin and tired. He spent my money on gifts for Lily, his real love, the girl from the neighboring village who worked as a teacher's assistant and dreamed of university. Beautiful, educated Lily, who never knew that her boyfriend's comfortable life was built on another girl's sacrifice. When Lily's opportunity came, a chance to take the entrance exams for the provincial university, Ryan panicked. He was supposed to support her, to help her study, to encourage her dreams. Instead, he spent his evenings lounging in my room, complaining about his work, demanding I fetch him food and entertainment, while Lily struggled alone with her textbooks. By flickering candlelight, Ryan lived in luxury that he thought he deserved. Lily failed her exams. Her dreams crumbled. Her future narrowed to marriage and motherhood in a village that would never understand her potential. And Ryan, in his infinite capacity for self-deception, decided that it was somehow my fault, that my devotion had made him lazy, that my sacrifices had weakened his character, that my love had ruined everything. He screamed at me the night she left for her parents' house, defeated and broken. He told me I was pathetic, clingy, a burden that had dragged down everyone around me. He said that Lily would have succeeded if not for me, that his own potential had been poisoned by my neediness, that I was a parasite who destroyed everything I touched, and I believed him. I spent the rest of that life trying to make amends for crimes I never committed, apologizing for love I never should have given, carrying guilt that was never mine to bear. I died young, worn down by years of believing I was fundamentally flawed, fundamentally destructive, fundamentally unworthy of happiness. But now I was 16 again, sitting in our small kitchen while my mother ladled porridge into chipped bowls. And I knew better. This time, when Ryan arrived in the village, I felt nothing but a cold, analytical clarity. I watched him charm the village officials, saw the calculating way he assessed which families might offer him the best accommodations, noticed how his eyes lingered on the prettier girls, while his voice remained respectfully distant. I saw him for what he truly was, a mediocre young man with an inflated sense of his own worth, looking for someone to use. This time, when he mentioned needing a place to stay, I didn't volunteer. Instead, I suggested he speak to old Widow Chen, whose house was larger and whose desperation for companionship might make her generous. When he hinted about the poor quality of his meals, I nodded sympathetically and recommended he try the noodle stand by the market. And when Emily Liu arrived in our village a month later, quiet, studious Emily, who'd been sent by her family to live with her aunt while she prepared for her university entrance exams, I offered her my room instead. The change was immediate and profound. Emily was grateful but not grasping, appreciative but not demanding. She helped with household chores without being asked, shared her textbooks with me, and filled our small house with the gentle rustling of pages and the scratch of pencils on paper. In the evenings, we studied together by candlelight, dreaming of lives beyond the village boundaries, encouraging each other's ambitions instead of draining them away. Meanwhile, Ryan struggled. Old Widow Chen, it turned out, was not the nurturing mother figure he'd expected. She was bitter, demanding, and quick to remind him that he was lucky she'd taken him in it all. She charged him rent he couldn't afford, fed him scraps, and expected him to help with the heavy labor around her property. Without my cushioning presence, Ryan faced the harsh reality of village life for the first time. I watched from a distance as he grew thin and tired, as his clothes became worn and dirty, as the arrogant confidence drained from his face. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with confusion, as if he couldn't understand why I no longer sought out his company, why I no longer offered him the comfort he'd grown accustomed to taking. But I felt nothing. The love that had once consumed me, that had once driven me to give everything I had and more, was gone. In its place was a protective coldness, a shield I built from hard-earned wisdom and self-respect. Without me to lean on, Ryan had to work harder, think more carefully, plan for his own future. But instead of growing stronger, he seemed to shrink. He'd become so accustomed to being cared for that he'd never developed the skills to care for himself. He complained constantly about his lodgings, his food, his treatment by the villagers. But he never seemed to understand that his comfort had always come at someone else's expense. As the months passed, Ryan grew increasingly desperate. His work at the grain distribution center was adequate but uninspired. His relationship with Lily remained distant without the security and comfort I provided. He had no energy left over for romance. He seemed to be aging rapidly, his youth curdling into premature bitterness. That's when he made his first real mistake. The village chief's daughter, Xiaomei, was a spoiled 16-year-old who liked to walk alone by the river despite her parents' warnings about the unstable banks. One afternoon, she slipped and fell into the water during the spring flood season. Ryan happened to be nearby, and whether by genuine impulse or calculated opportunity, he jumped in to pull her out. It wasn't particularly heroic. The water was shallow and the current mild, but Xiaomei was dramatic and grateful, and her father was influential and relieved. Within a week, Ryan found himself engaged to the village chief's daughter and promoted to assistant supervisor. At the grain center, I watched this unfold with a kind of detached fascination. In my first life, Ryan had been too comfortable, cushioned by my devotion to pursue ambitious schemes. Now, desperate and struggling, he was making bold moves, playing political games, securing advantages through manipulation rather than merit. But there was something hollow about his victory. Xiaomei was pretty but shallow, interested in Ryan only as a romantic figure from her rescue fantasy. The engagement was more performance than partnership, and Ryan seemed to know it. Even as his material circumstances improved, even as he moved into better housing and gained social status. There was a restless dissatisfaction in his eyes. He kept watching me. I would catch him staring during village meetings, his gaze following me as I walked with Emily to the market or sat reading under the old oak tree by the school. There was something hungry and confused in his expression, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution. Emily noticed it too. He looks at you like you owe him something, she said one evening as we worked through practice problems for the university entrance exams. Her voice was mild, but there was a protective edge to it that made my chest warm with gratitude. Let him look, I replied, not raising my eyes from my textbook. It cost him more than it cost me. And it was true. Ryan's obsession with my indifference was eating away at him, creating a constant background tension that affected everything else in his life. He began making excuses to visit our house, ostensibly to check on village business with my father, but always finding reasons to linger, to try to catch my attention, to recreate some echo of our former dynamic. I treated him with polite disinterest, the same courtesy I'd show any village acquaintance. I answered his questions briefly, offered him tea if he was thirsty, and otherwise continued with my activities as if he weren't there. The more normal and unremarkable I made our interactions, the more agitated he became. Meanwhile, Emily and I grew closer. We studied together every evening, shared our hopes and fears, supported each other through the grueling preparation for the university entrance exams. She was brilliant and kind, with a sharp wit that made even the most difficult problems seem manageable. For the first time in either of my lives, I understood what real friendship felt like: mutual respect, shared goals, emotional support that flowed both ways instead of being drained by one person's endless needs. The night before the university entrance exams, Emily and I stayed up late reviewing our notes one final time. The candlelight flickered across our papers, casting dancing shadows on the walls as we tested each other on chemistry formulas and historical dates. There was a sacred quality to those hours, a sense that we were on the threshold of transformation, that everything we'd worked for was about to be decided. Whatever happens tomorrow, Emily said as we finally prepared for bed. I'm grateful. We went through this together. I squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses we'd both developed from months of writing practice. We're going to pass, I told her. Both of us. I can feel it. And we did. When the results were posted 6 weeks later, both Emily's name and mine appeared on the acceptance list for Beijing Normal University. We screamed and cried and hugged each other in the village square, surrounded by neighbors who cheered and clapped as if our success belonged to the entire community. Ryan's name was not on the list. I saw him standing at the edge of the crowd, his face pale and tight with something that looked like rage. Xiaomei clung to his arm, chattering excitedly about the celebration her father was planning. But Ryan's eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Later that evening, as Emily and I sat in our room making plans for our departure to Beijing, I heard raised voices from the courtyard. Through the window, I could see Ryan arguing with my father, his gestures sharp and agitated. She's making a mistake, I heard him say. Village girls don't belong in the city. She'll come back broken and bitter, mark my words. My father's response was too quiet to hear, but his posture was rigid with barely controlled anger. After a few more minutes, Ryan stalked away, his face dark with frustration. He's jealous, Emily observed from where she sat on the bed, sorting through her few possessions. He probably thought he'd pass automatically just because he's from the city originally. Probably. I agreed. But there was something else in Ryan's expression that troubled me. It wasn't just jealousy, it was a kind of possessive fury, as if my success was somehow a theft from him, as if I'd taken something that rightfully belonged to him. Emily and I left for Beijing 2 weeks later. The entire village turned out to see us off. pressing small gifts and good wishes into our hands as we climbed onto the bus. That would take us to the train station. My parents cried and told me to write often. My sister made me promise to send pictures of the big city. Ryan was nowhere to be seen. The next 4 years passed like a dream I'd never dared to have. Beijing Normal University was everything I'd imagined and more, a world of learning and possibility, where ideas mattered more than social status and hard work was rewarded with opportunity. Emily and I shared a dormitory room, and our friendship deepened into something like sisterhood as we navigated the challenges of university life together. I threw myself into my studies with the passion of someone who knew how precious this chance was. Education theory, child psychology, literature, history, every subject felt like a revelation. Every new concept like a key unlocking doors I hadn't even known existed. My professors noticed my dedication and began recommending me for additional opportunities, research projects, tutoring positions, student leadership roles. By my senior year, I had secured a position teaching at a prestigious elementary school in Beijing. The job came with good pay, benefits, and the kind of social respect that had seemed impossible from the vantage point of my village. Childhood. I was 22 years old and felt like I could accomplish anything. Emily had her own successes, landing a job with an international development organization that would allow her to travel and use her language skills. We promised to stay in touch, to visit each other regularly, to never let distance weaken the bond we'd forged through shared struggle and mutual support. The night before graduation, as we packed up our dormitory room for the last time, Emily looked at me with a smile that held both pride and sadness. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd made different choices?" she asked. "If you'd given your room to someone else, or stayed focused on village life instead of dreaming about university?" I paused in the middle of folding my teacher's certificate, considering her question. The truth was both simple and impossibly complex. "I think I would have been very unhappy," I said finally. "I think I would have spent my whole life feeling like I was living someone else's story instead of my own." "I'm glad you chose differently," Emily said. "I'm glad you chose us. Me, too," I thought, but didn't say. More than she could ever know. I heard about Ryan occasionally through letters from home. His marriage to Xiaomei had been brief and unhappy, ending in divorce after less than 2 years. He'd lost his position at the grain distribution center due to some kind of financial irregularity. My mother's letters were vague on the details, but the implication was that money had gone missing. He'd moved to the county seat, then to the provincial capital, chasing opportunities that never quite materialized. The reports painted a picture of a man in steady decline, unable to build anything lasting, always looking for shortcuts and advantages that would restore him to a comfort he'd never actually earned. I felt no satisfaction in his struggles, but no sympathy either. His fate was the natural consequence of choices he'd made freely, lessons he'd refused to learn. I had my own life to build, my own students to teach, my own future to create. For 3 years, I heard nothing about Ryan at all. I threw myself into my work at the school, earning praise from parents and administrators for my innovative teaching methods and genuine care for my students. I rented a small but comfortable apartment in a good neighborhood, filled it with books and plants and artwork that made me smile. I made friends among my colleagues, went on dates with interesting men, traveled during school holidays to places I'd only read about as a village girl. I was happy, genuinely, completely happy in a way. That had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or attention. The contrast with my first life was so stark it sometimes took my breath away. The difference between existing and truly living, between surviving and thriving. And then, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon in March, I saw him again. I was leaving the school after staying late to prepare materials for the next day's lessons, when I noticed a figure standing across the street, partially hidden in the shadow of a shop awning. Something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders, made me look more carefully. It was Ryan. Older now, thinner, with premature lines around his eyes and a hardness to his mouth that hadn't been there in the village. His clothes were clean but worn, and there was something desperate in the way he watched the school entrance, as if he'd been waiting there for hours. Our eyes met across the street, and I saw recognition flare in his face, followed immediately by something more complex: anger, longing, resentment, and a kind of hungry desperation that made my stomach clench with unease. I turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward the bus stop that would take me home. I didn't run, didn't hurry, just moved with the calm confidence of someone who had every right to be where she was, doing what she was doing. But I could feel him following me. The sensation crawled up my spine like ice water, that primitive awareness of being hunted that no amount of civilized education could entirely suppress. I kept my pace steady, my expression neutral, but my heart was hammering against my ribs as I reached the bus stop and joined the small crowd of commuters waiting for the evening buses. Ryan approached slowly, as if I were a wild animal that might bolt if he moved too quickly. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he stopped and cleared his throat. "Sarah," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like both a prayer and an accusation. I turned to look at him with a polite, slightly puzzled expression I might give any stranger who'd addressed me unexpectedly. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" The question hit him like a physical blow. His face went white, then flushed dark red, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike me. "Don't," he said, his voice low and shaking. "Don't pretend you don't remember me. Don't pretend we don't have history." "Oh," I said, letting recognition dawn slowly across my features. "Ryan, from the village. My goodness, it's been years. How are you?" My tone was friendly but distant, the way you might greet a childhood acquaintance you'd barely known and hadn't thought about since. It was exactly the reaction he couldn't bear being treated as forgettable, unremarkable. Just another face from a shared past that had left no lasting impression. "How am I?" he repeated, and there was something wild in his eyes now. "How do? You think I am? Look at me, Sarah. Look at what I've become." I did look at him, taking in the worn clothes, the tired face, the bitter set of his mouth. But instead of the pity or guilt or concern he seemed to expect, I felt only a kind of detached curiosity, the way I might observe an interesting case study in one of my education psychology textbooks. "You look tired," I said simply. "Are you working in Beijing now?" The question seemed to infuriate him further. "Working? You want to know if I'm working? I'm surviving, Sarah. Barely. I'm living in a room smaller than the closet in the house you grew up in, doing manual labor for men half my education, scraping together enough money to eat once a day if I'm lucky." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it in the abstract way you might feel sorry for any struggling stranger. "Have you considered going back to school? There are adult education programs, vocational training." "Stop," he said sharply. "Just stop. Don't stand there and offer me advice like you're some kind of social worker doing charity. Don't pretend you don't know exactly why I'm here." But I genuinely didn't know. The Ryan I remembered from my first life had been selfish and manipulative, but he'd never been openly aggressive, never been the type to track someone down and confront them in the street. This version of him, forged by years of hardship and disappointment, was something new and potentially dangerous. "I'm not pretending anything," I said carefully. "I'm just not sure what you want from me." "What I want." He laughed, a harsh sound, with no humor in it. "I want you to explain to me how you could just walk away. How you could just stop caring, stop loving me, like it meant nothing. Like I meant nothing." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt something shift inside my chest, not the old pain, not the familiar ache of unrequited love, but something colder and cleaner. Understanding, maybe, or just profound sadness for the man he might have been if he'd learned different lessons, made different choices. Ryan, I said gently, I was 16 years old. What I felt for you then wasn't love, it was infatuation. Obsession, maybe. The kind of thing teenagers feel before they understand what real partnership looks like. Don't, he said again, more, quietly now. Don't minimize it. Don't pretend it wasn't real. I know what I saw in your eyes. Sarah, I know how you looked at me. You're right, I admitted. It was real for me at the time, but it wasn't healthy and it wasn't sustainable. I gave too much and you took too much, and it would have destroyed us both if I'd let it continue. So you just stopped. The question came out broken, confused. You just decided you didn't love me anymore. I considered how to answer that, how to explain the complexity of growth and change and self-preservation to someone who seemed stuck in a moment from 8 years ago. I decided to love myself instead. I said finally, I decided that my dreams and my future were worth protecting. I decided that real love, the kind worth having, should make both people stronger, not drain one person to feed the other. And look how well that worked out for you, he said, gesturing at my professional clothes, my confident posture, my obvious health and happiness. But there was no admiration in his voice, only bitter resentment. Look at your fancy job, your city life, your success, all built on abandoning the people who needed you. No, I said, feeling a flare of anger for the first time in this conversation. Built on working hard, making sacrifices for my education, and surrounding myself with people who supported my goals instead of undermining them. Built on choosing to invest in relationships that gave back instead of just taking. You mean Emily, he said, and there was venom in his voice when he spoke her name. Sweet little Emily, who got to benefit from all the generosity you used to show me, who got your room, your attention, your help with studying, who got to be your perfect little friend, while I was left to struggle alone. Emily earned my friendship, I said coldly. She supported my dreams instead of dismissing them. She encouraged me to aim higher instead of trying to keep me small. She gave as much as she took, and she never, ever made me feel like my love was a burden or a mistake. The comparison hit him exactly as I'd intended it to, and I watched him flinch as if I'd slapped him. But instead of backing down, instead of showing any recognition of his own role in destroying what we'd once had, he leaned forward with his eyes blazing. You think you're so much better than me now, he said. You think your success makes you superior, makes your choices right and mine wrong. But I know the truth, Sarah. I know that everything you have, everything you've accomplished, you built on the foundation of my failure. You needed me to fail so you could succeed. You needed me to be miserable so you could be happy. The accusation was so absurd, so completely disconnected from reality, that for a moment I could only stare at him. This was the same twisted logic he'd used in my first life. The same refusal to take responsibility for his own choices. The same desperate need to make someone else the villain in his story. That's not how life works, Ryan, I said. Your failure didn't cause my success. My success didn't cause your failure. We made different choices, and we're living with different consequences. It's really that simple. Nothing is that simple. He snarled. You can't just, but whatever he'd been about. To say was cut off by the arrival of my bus. The doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, and the evening commuters began boarding in an orderly line. I pulled my bus pass from my purse and took a step toward the entrance. Goodbye, Ryan, I said without looking back at him. I hope you find what you're looking for. I climbed onto the bus and found a seat near the back, expecting to feel relief as we pulled away from the curb. Instead, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and unease, as if this encounter had opened a door that should have remained closed. Through the window, I could see Ryan still standing at the bus stop, watching our bus disappear into the evening. Traffic. even from a distance, even through the glass and metal that separated us. I could feel the intensity of his stare, the weight of his unresolved obsession. He wasn't going to let this go. I knew that with the same certainty I'd known at 16 that I needed to choose a different path. Ryan had spent 8 years nurturing his resentment, feeding his sense of grievance, building a mythology around our failed relationship that cast him as the victim and me as the villain. A single conversation, no matter how clear or firm, wasn't going to shatter those delusions. He was going to keep coming. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice signs of his continued presence in my life. A figure watching from across the street when I left work. Phone calls to my apartment that went silent when I answered. Letters slipped under my door, filled with rambling accusations and demands for explanations I'd already given. I saved the letters, documented the incidents, and reported them to the police, but without explicit threats or physical violence. There was little they could do beyond filing reports and advising me to be careful. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but realistic about the limitations of the law. Obsessive behavior like this often escalates. She warned me, make sure someone always knows where you are. Vary your routines. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong. I took her advice seriously, but I refused to let Ryan's fixation control my life. I continued teaching, continued spending time with friends, continued building the future I'd worked so hard to create. I just did it all with more awareness, more caution, more attention to the shadows where damaged men might lurk. The confrontation came, inevitably, on a rainy Thursday evening in May. I was walking home from a colleague's apartment, where we'd spent the evening grading papers and planning our summer curriculum. It was later than usual, nearly 10 o'clock, and the streets were largely empty, except for the occasional taxi or late-night food vendor. The rain had started during dinner, and by the time I left, it had intensified into the kind of steady downpour that drove most people indoors. I was hurrying toward the subway entrance, my umbrella providing minimal protection against the wind-driven rain, when I heard footsteps behind me matching my pace. I glanced back and saw Ryan following about 20 feet behind, his clothes soaked, his hair plastered to his head, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my heart skip. I quickened my pace, but he quickened his as well. When I reached the subway entrance, I realized with growing alarm that the station was closed for late-night maintenance, something I'd forgotten in my rush to get out of the rain. The metal gates were pulled across the entrance, and signs in Chinese and English announced that service wouldn't resume until 6 a.m. I was trapped on an empty street, with a man whose grip on reality had been slipping for weeks. I turned to face him, keeping my umbrella between us like a shield, and tried to project a confidence I didn't feel. "Ryan, this has to stop," I said firmly, following me, watching me. "Leaving letters it's harassment, and it's illegal. You need to get help." He stopped about 10 feet away, rain streaming down his face, and I was shocked by how wild he looked. His eyes were bloodshot and rimmed with exhaustion, his cheeks hollow with what looked like weeks of poor eating and little sleep. This wasn't just obsession anymore, this was a complete breakdown. "Help," he repeated and started laughing. "You think I need help? You're the one who needs help, Sarah. You're the one who's sick, who's twisted, who destroyed everything good and pure between us and then walked away like it meant nothing." "There was nothing good between us," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There was just me giving everything and you taking everything, until there was nothing left of me to give. That's not love, Ryan. That's not even friendship. That's just exploitation. Exploitation." He repeated the word like it was a foreign concept. "Is that what you call it when someone loves you completely, unconditionally, with everything they have? Is that what you call sacrifice and devotion and putting someone else's needs before your own? I call it unhealthy," I said, "and unsustainable, and ultimately destructive to everyone involved." So you admit it, he said, taking a step closer. You admit that you destroyed us. You admit that you took something beautiful and ruined it because you were too selfish, too cold, too calculating to appreciate what you had. I could see now that there was no reasoning with him, no way to make him understand that the dynamic he remembered as beautiful had actually been toxic. In his mind, the story was already written. I was the villain who had rejected true love in favor of shallow ambition, and he was the tragic hero whose life had been ruined by my cruelty. I'm going to call the police, I said, pulling out my phone. You need to leave me alone, Ryan. This ends now. But as I started to dial, he lunged forward and knocked the phone from my hands. It clattered across the wet pavement and came to rest near a storm drain. The screen cracked but still glowing. No, he said, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. No more running. No more hiding. No more pretending you don't remember what we had. You're going to listen to me, Sarah. You're going to hear what you've done. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, and I could feel his desperation transforming into something more dangerous. This was no longer about love or even obsession. This was about power, about forcing me to acknowledge his version of events, about making me pay for the crime of moving on with my life. Let go of me, I said, putting all the authority I'd learned as a teacher into my voice, right now. But instead of releasing me, he pulled me closer until I could smell the rain and sweat and something sour on his breath. That might have been alcohol or just the scent of someone who'd stopped taking care of himself. 8 years, he whispered, his face inches from mine. 8 years I've thought about you, dreamed about you, tried to understand how someone could love so completely and then just stop. 8 years of wondering what I did wrong, what I could have done differently, how I could win you back. You can't win me back, I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fear climbing up my throat. Because I was never really yours to begin with. What I felt for you when I was 16 wasn't love, it was dependency, obsession, a sick need to be needed. And what you felt for me wasn't love either, it was just convenience. Just appreciation for having someone cater to your every whim without expecting anything in return. That's not true, he said, but there was something cracking in his voice. That's not true. I loved you. I needed you. You were everything to me. No, I said, meeting his eyes steadily. I was useful to you. There's a difference. For a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, or the shadow of self-awareness. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by a rage so pure and hot that I could feel it radiating from his skin. You heartless bitch, he snarled. You cold, calculating, selfish bitch. You took everything I had to give and then threw it away like garbage. You ruined my life, ruined my future, ruined everything I could have been. And now you stand there and tell me it meant nothing. It meant what it meant, I said. But it's over now. It's been over for 8 years. You need to accept that and move on. Move on. He was shouting now, his voice echoing off the empty buildings around us. Move on to what? To poverty and failure and loneliness while you live in comfort and success built on my misery? Move on to watching you be happy while I suffer for the crime of loving you too much. You're suffering because you never learned to build a life for yourself, I said. Because you never developed the skills or the character to create your own happiness instead of depending on someone else to provide it for you. Your misery isn't my fault, Ryan. Your failure isn't my responsibility. Your loneliness isn't my problem to solve. The words hit him like physical blows, and with each one his grip on my wrist tightened until I was sure he was going to leave. Bruises. But I didn't try to pull away anymore. Instead, I stood perfectly still and let him absorb the truth he'd been running from for nearly a decade. I hate you, he whispered finally, and there were tears mixing with the rain on his face. I hate you so much it's like poison in my veins. I hate your success. I hate your happiness. I hate the way you look at me like I'm nothing. Like I never mattered. Like the best years of my life were just a mistake you've moved on from. I don't hate you. I said quietly. I don't feel anything for you at all. And that's what you can't forgive, isn't it? Not that I stopped loving you, but that I stopped thinking about you entirely. The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. His hand loosened on my wrist, and I stepped back, putting distance between us. In the harsh glow of the street light, he looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his own delusions finally crashing down round him. You were supposed to suffer, he said, his voice barely audible above the rain. You were supposed to regret leaving me, supposed to realize what you'd lost. You were supposed to come back. I was supposed to live my own life, I replied. And that's exactly what I did. I picked up my phone from the wet pavement, relieved to see it was still functional despite the cracked screen. Ryan made no move to stop me as I dialed the police, made no protest as I gave them our location and described the situation in calm, clear tones. By the time the officers arrived, Ryan was sitting on the curb with his head in his hands, looking more like a lost child than a dangerous stalker. They questioned us both, took my statement about the weeks of harassment, and ultimately decided to take him in for psychiatric evaluation rather than immediate arrest. As they guided him toward their car, he looked back at me one last time. The rage was gone from his eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like relief, as if finally being stopped, finally facing consequences, was easier than carrying the weight of his obsession any longer. I really did love you, he said, as they opened the car door. I know you did, I replied, but love isn't supposed to hurt this much. 3 months later, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from Ryan, written on hospital stationery, and the handwriting was steadier than I'd seen from him in years. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs acknowledging that he'd been sick, that his behavior had been unacceptable, that he was getting help. He didn't ask for forgiveness or understanding. He didn't try to justify his actions or blame me for his choices. He simply apologized and promised to leave me alone. I kept the letter for a few days, reading it over and trying to decide how I felt about this apparent transformation. In the end, I decided it didn't matter. Whether his change was genuine or temporary, whether he'd truly learned from his mistakes, or was simply saying what his doctors wanted to hear, wasn't my concern anymore. I threw the letter away and got on with my life. Years passed. I continued teaching, eventually became a principal, then moved into educational policy work. I married a kind man who supported my ambitions and shared my values. We had children who grew up confident and secure, knowing they were loved without conditions or expectations of sacrifice. Sometimes, usually when I was working with troubled students or their families, I would think about Ryan and wonder what had become of him. I hoped he'd found peace, found a way to build genuine connections instead of dependent ones, found happiness that didn't require someone else's misery as its foundation. But mostly, I didn't think about him at all. The girl who had died at 23, broken by the weight of unreciprocated love and misplaced guilt, was gone. In her place was a woman who understood the difference between love and obsession, between generosity and self-destruct, between caring for someone and losing yourself. In the process, I had been reborn not just in body, but in spirit. And this time, I had chosen wisely. The love I gave now was healthy love, measured, mutual, sustainable. The sacrifices I made were conscious choices that strengthened rather than depleted me. The life I built was my own, constructed on the foundation of self-respect rather than self-denial. And if that made me selfish in the eyes of those who preferred their women diminished and dependent, then so be it. I would rather be called selfish than live selflessly in service to someone else's comfort. While my own dreams withered and died, I had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. That sometimes saving yourself is the only salvation that matters. that sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing your own happiness over someone else's expectations. I had been given a second chance, and I had not wasted it. And that, in the end, was enough.